The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which Lady Evelyn Ashford would later think was a peculiarly ordinary day for the end of a life. She had been in the garden at Ashford Hall, cutting the last of the autumn roses before the frost claimed them, when Mrs. Pemberton came hurrying across the lawn with her apron still dusted with flour and her face the color of ash. Evelyn knew before the housekeeper spoke a single word. She had learned, in the 3 months since her father's sudden collapse at his writing desk, to read catastrophe in the set of another person's shoulders. "It's the solicitor, my lady. He says—" Mrs. Pemberton pressed a hand to her mouth. "He says you must come to London at once. There is a matter of your father's debts." Evelyn set down her shears with great care, because her hands had begun to tremble, and she did not wish the older woman to see it. "What debts, Mrs. Pemberton? My father kept the estate books scrupulously. I have seen them myself." "I do not know, my lady. Only that the solicitor used the word ruin." The word followed Evelyn all the way to London, rattling inside the carriage with every turn of the wheels, until it had worn a groove into her so deep she thought she might never think another thought again. She was 23 years old. She had buried her father in July, in a churchyard still green with summer, had stood dry-eyed through the service because someone had to remain composed for her mother's sake, and had spent every night since lying awake trying to reconcile the quiet, ordinary man she had known with the sudden, unexplained stillness of his death. He had gone to bed complaining of nothing more than a slight headache and had simply not woken. The physician had called it an apoplexy of the heart. Evelyn had accepted the explanation because there had seemed, at the time, no reason to question it. Now, in October, she sat across a mahogany desk from a solicitor named Mr. Whitfield, who could not quite meet her eyes. "Lady Evelyn," he began, and stopped, and began again. "Your father borrowed a considerable sum 11 years ago, £40,000, from the House of Ravenshire. The loan was never repaid, with the accrued interest, and given the terms of the original agreement." He slid a paper across the desk as though it might bite her. "The debt now stands at nearly £100,000. Under the law, the Duke of Ravenshire is entitled to seize Ashford Hall, its lands, and any remaining assets of the estate, including the family's title of precedence at court." Evelyn did not touch the paper. She was looking instead at a smaller detail, the date at the top, and her father's signature beneath it, a signature she knew as well as her own hand, slanted and quick and faintly impatient, exactly as he had always written it. "11 years ago," she said slowly, "I was 12. I do not recall my father ever mentioning Ravenshire, not once, in all the years since. Not at dinner, not in his correspondence, not even in his final illness, when men are said to unburden themselves of every secret. That is not unusual, my lady, in matters of shame. My father was not a man who felt shame quietly." She looked up. "He wore his failures the way other men wear medals. If he owed a debt of that size, the entire county would have known of it within a fortnight. He would have complained of Ravenshire's terms over every dinner table in Hampshire." Mr. Whitfield had no answer for that. He only folded his hands and said, with the particular gentleness men reserve for delivering news they know to be unbearable, that the Crown's officers would arrive within the week to begin the process of seizure, unless some other arrangement could be reached. "What other arrangement?" Evelyn asked, though something in her chest had already gone cold and still, the way a lake stills before ice takes it. "The Duke has requested an audience with you, personally, before the Royal Council convenes on the matter." By the time Evelyn returned to her rented lodgings that evening, for Ashford House in town had already been let to strangers, one of the smaller humiliations of the past 3 months, word of the summons had somehow already reached her aunt, Lady Corbin, who arrived within the hour in a state of barely contained hysteria. £100,000, Lady Corbin said, sinking into a chair and pressing a handkerchief to her brow, as though the sum itself might be caught like a fever. "Evelyn, my dear girl, do you understand what this means? The Duke of Ravenshire is not a man known for mercy. He is known for precision. Whatever he intends to ask of you, you may be certain it has been calculated to serve his own interest entirely. Then it will not be a proposal born of romance, aunt. That much I had already surmised. Do not be flippant. This is not a matter for wit. Lady Corbin's eyes were sharp with a fear Evelyn recognized, because it was the same fear that had lived beneath her own ribs since July. Your mother cannot survive further scandal, Evelyn. She has scarcely survived your father's death. If the estate is seized, if you are cast out into whatever meager situation your dowry might afford you both, I do not know that she will recover from it at all. Evelyn said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would not sound either like false comfort or unbearable truth, and she had grown weary, in 3 short months, of offering either. She had heard of the Duke of Ravenshire, the way one hears of weather in a distant country, as fact, not experience. He was young for his title, not yet 30, having inherited it after his own father's death some 4 years past. A death she now recalled had been attributed, vaguely, to a hunting accident on the Ravenshire estate. He was known to be exacting, unsentimental, and immensely wealthy, a man who attended few balls and left the ones he did attend before the dancing properly began. Some called him cold, others, more unkindly, called him cruel, and pointed to the ruin of 2 lesser families as proof, though Evelyn had never troubled herself to learn the particulars. Now she stood in the anteroom of Ravenshire House, in a gown 3 seasons out of fashion, waiting to meet the man who held her family's entire future in his hands, and she found she could not remember a single detail she had heard about him, only the cold, empty space where certainty used to be. The doors opened. He was taller than she expected, and darker. Dark hair, dark eyes, a face composed with the kind of stillness that comes from long practice rather than natural calm. He did not smile. He did not offer the small courtesies of greeting that other men offered a lady in distress. He simply looked at her for a long moment, as though he were reading something written beneath her skin, and then gestured to a chair. "Lady Evelyn, please, sit." "I would rather stand, Your Grace, if it is all the same to you. I understand you hold the power to destroy my family. I would like to face that news on my feet." Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but an acknowledgement, the way one nods at an opponent who has made a fair opening move. Very well. He remained standing as well, which she had not expected. "I will not waste your time with false sympathy, Lady Evelyn. The debt is real. The law is clear. I could seize Ashford Hall within the week, and no court in England would question my right to do so. Then why have you not already done it?" "Because I have another proposal." He clasped his hands behind his back, and for the first time she saw something flicker behind his composure. Not cruelty, she thought, but something far more complicated. "Marry me, and the debt is forgiven in its entirety. Your mother retains her dower rights. Your family's name remains untouched by scandal. You will be a duchess, Lady Evelyn, not a beggar." The room seemed to tilt very slightly. "You are proposing marriage as a form of debt collection. I am proposing marriage as an alternative to your family's complete ruin. Call it what you like. The kingdom will call it what it is, a wealthy man buying a wife because he could not find one willing to have him honestly." For the briefest moment, something like pain crossed his face, gone so quickly she might have imagined it. "The kingdom's opinion is not my concern." "It is mine," Evelyn said, and heard her own voice shake for the first time. "I have spent 3 months watching my mother waste away with grief. I will not spend the rest of my life as a transaction in your ledger, Your Grace, no matter how kindly you dress the terms. I am not asking you to answer today." His voice had gone very quiet. "You have 3 days. Consider it carefully, Lady Evelyn. I do not think you understand yet what refusal will cost you. And what, precisely, do you understand of what it will cost me to accept?" He did not answer that. She thought, looking back on it later, that this silence had been the first true thing he had told her, that he did not know how to answer her, and that the not knowing troubled him more than he wished her to see. She left Ravenshire House with her spine straight and her hands clenched inside her gloves, and she did not cry until she was safely inside the carriage, where no one, not even the Duke of Ravenshire, whose dark, unreadable eyes she could not stop seeing, could witness it. Chapter 2. 3 days was not enough time to grieve a life she had not yet lost, and yet it was somehow also an eternity. Each hour stretched thin with dread. Evelyn spent the first day at her mother's bedside, saying nothing of the proposal, watching Lady Ashford drift between sleep and a kind of waking absence that frightened Evelyn more than any debt ever could. Her mother had once been a woman of considerable wit and warmth, fond of music and long walks and the small daily pleasures of a well-run household. Grief had hollowed all of that away, leaving behind something quiet and diminished that Evelyn scarcely recognized. "You look tired, my darling," Lady Ashford murmured once, in a rare moment of lucidity, reaching for Evelyn's hand with fingers that had grown thin as a bird's wing. "Has something happened? You may tell me. I am not so broken as everyone believes." Evelyn considered, for one aching moment, telling her the truth. But she thought of what the knowledge might do to a woman already so fragile, and instead she only smoothed the coverlet and said that nothing had happened at all, that she was only weary from the journey to town, and watched her mother's eyes drift closed again, unconvinced but too tired to press further. She spent the second day walking the grounds of Ashford Hall, memorizing it, the crooked apple tree she had climbed as a girl, the stone bridge over the stream where her father used to fish, the library where she had taught herself Latin out of sheer stubbornness, because no one had thought to teach a girl such things, and where, she recalled now, her father had once shown her a hidden compartment beneath the floor, with a solemnity that had seemed strange to her at the time. She had been perhaps 8 years old. She had not thought of it in 15 years. She spent that evening writing letters she did not intend to send, to her father, dead and unable to explain himself, to the Duke, full of arguments she knew would not move him, to some imagined future version of herself, asking what choice that woman had made, and whether she had been right to make it. She burned all of them in the library grate before the candles guttered out. On the third night she made her decision, though decision felt too generous a word for what was, in truth, a kind of desperate flight. She would not marry a stranger to settle a debt she did not believe her father had ever truly owed. Something about the transaction sat wrong in her, a splinter she could not work free, the timing of it, the size of the sum, her father's unbroken silence on the matter even in the depths of his final illness, the strange coincidence of the Duke's own father's death some years prior, of which she suddenly found herself thinking more than she ever had before. She did not have proof of anything. She had only instinct, and instinct told her that the Duke of Ravenshire was not offering mercy. He was collecting something, and she did not yet understand what. So she packed a single bag, dressed herself in a servant's plain wool gown borrowed from Mrs. Pemberton's own trunk, and left a letter on her writing desk addressed to the Duke. "Your Grace, I will not be bought, even for the price of my family's survival. If there is mercy in you, I ask that you show it to my mother, who has done nothing to deserve this ruin. As for myself, I would rather face whatever the law demands of me than spend my life as payment for a debt I do not believe was ever real. E. Ashford." Mrs. Pemberton wept when she understood what Evelyn intended and begged her not to go, and when begging failed, pressed a small purse of coin into Evelyn's hands and would not be refused. "You were a wild, clever little thing as a girl," the housekeeper said, holding Evelyn's face between her worn hands as though memorizing it. "Do not let this kingdom teach you to be tame now, when tameness has never once served this family well." Evelyn left before dawn, on foot as far as the crossroads, then by whatever cart or coach would carry a plain servant girl north without questions asked. She had some vague notion of reaching her mother's cousin in Yorkshire, a woman she had met only twice, but who she believed might shelter her until she could determine some better course. It was not, she understood even as she undertook it, a well-considered plan. It was the plan of a woman who had run out of better options and could not bear to stand still and wait for ruin to arrive at her door instead. She was captured before dawn the following morning, less than a day into her flight, at a coaching inn near the northern border, where a sharp-eyed constable recognized the fine stitching on her borrowed gown's collar, incongruous against its plain wool, a small vanity of Mrs. Pemberton's own needlework that neither of them had thought to consider. Fleeing an official marriage decree issued under the seal of the Crown, she was informed, in a tone that suggested the man reciting it took no particular pleasure in the words, constituted an act of treason against the king's law. The punishment was death. She was returned to London in chains she had never imagined she would wear, past crowds that gathered to watch the disgraced Ashford girl dragged through the streets, some jeering, more simply staring with the hungry, uneasy fascination of people who suspect they are witnessing an injustice but lack the courage to say so aloud. She was placed in a cell in the Tower to await her execution, which was set for 3 days hence, the same span of time she had once been given to accept a proposal she had thought, in her pride, that she could refuse. In the cold stone quiet of that cell, Evelyn found herself thinking not of her own death, which felt strangely distant and unreal, but of her mother, and of the letter she had left behind, and of the Duke's face in the moment she had asked him what her acceptance might cost, and his silence in return. She wondered, in the small hours before dawn on her final morning, whether he had read her letter. She wondered whether it had troubled him at all. The morning of her execution was clear and cold, the kind of bright autumn day that seemed almost cruel in its beauty. Evelyn stood on the scaffold with her hands bound before her, and she found, strangely, that she was not afraid so much as exhausted. Exhausted by 3 months of grief and disgrace and fear, exhausted by a fight she had not chosen and could not seem to win. She looked out at the crowd and did not find her mother's face among them, and was grateful for it. She did not want the last thing her mother saw to be this. The executioner raised his hand. "Stop!" The voice cut through the square like a blade through silk, and Evelyn's head turned before she had decided to move it. The Duke of Ravenshire was pushing through the crowd on foot, without escort, his greatcoat unbuttoned as though he had left his carriage still moving to reach her in time. His face, always so composed, was stripped bare of every careful mask she had seen him wear in his drawing-room 3 days before. What remained beneath it looked, to her astonishment, very much like terror. "By what authority?" the king's officer began. "By the authority of a man asking for royal mercy," the Duke said, and turned, not to the officer, but past him, toward the king's own box at the edge of the square, where His Majesty had come to observe the proceedings in person, as was his custom for matters involving noble houses. The Duke went down on one knee in the dirt of the square, in front of half of London, a gesture Evelyn understood even through her shock, to be a kind of public humiliation he was choosing to bear for her sake, though she could not fathom why. "Your Majesty, I ask for one act of mercy. Let Lady Evelyn Ashford be spared the sentence of treason, and let the matter be resolved instead, as it was always meant to be resolved, through marriage, freely entered, before the law and before God." A murmur ran through the crowd like wind through wheat. Evelyn heard, distantly, someone behind her whisper that the ruthless Duke of Ravenshire had gone mad with guilt, and someone else answer that a man did not kneel in the dirt before his king for guilt alone. The king regarded the Duke for a long moment, and Evelyn, standing on the scaffold with the rope still within reach of her bound hands, understood with a sinking clarity that her fate had once again been placed into the hands of men who spoke of her as though she were not standing directly before them. "Lady Evelyn," the king said at last, "you have heard the Duke's petition. You may accept it, and live as his wife, or you may decline it, and the original sentence shall stand. Choose." She looked down at the Duke, still kneeling in the dirt, his dark eyes fixed on hers, with an intensity she did not understand and did not trust. She thought of her mother. She thought of Ashford Hall, and the crooked apple tree, and the debt that did not make sense, and the letter she had left behind that had, in the end, changed nothing at all except to bring this man running through the streets of London on foot to save her. "I accept," she said, and the words tasted like ash in her mouth, and she did not know, standing there in the cold October light, that she had just spoken the truest words of her life without understanding a single one of them. Chapter 3. The wedding was arranged with unseemly haste and no pretense of celebration. Evelyn stood before the altar of a small private chapel 3 days after her execution had been halted, in a borrowed gown of pale blue silk that fit her poorly across the shoulders, and spoke vows to a man she had met twice, both times under circumstances that felt more like negotiation than courtship. The Duke's voice, when he spoke his own vows, was steady and low, and once, only once, she thought she heard something catch in it, some emotion he swallowed before it could surface. She did not look at him again until the ceremony was done. There was no wedding breakfast, no gathering of well-wishers, no small mercies of celebration to soften the strangeness of the day. Evelyn understood this was, perhaps, its own kind of consideration, that Alexander had spared her the further ordeal of standing before curious eyes and false congratulations on a day already heavy enough with grief and confusion. But it left the day feeling unfinished, suspended, as though she had crossed some vast threshold without anyone troubling to mark the crossing at all. That night, in the grand and unfamiliar bedchamber of Ravenshire House, Evelyn sat on the edge of a bed larger than any she had ever slept in, dressed in a nightgown that was not her own, and waited for what she had been raised to understand was her wifely obligation, bracing herself against it the way one braces against a blow one cannot avoid. The Duke entered without knocking. It was, after all, his own chamber, and stopped several feet from the bed. He looked, she thought, almost as uncertain as she felt, which struck her as such an unlikely thing to see in the composed, terrifying man from the royal council chamber that she nearly forgot to be afraid. "I am not going to touch you," he said without preamble. "Not tonight, not until you wish it, and I do not expect that you ever will, given how we have arrived at this room." Evelyn stared at him. "Then why the marriage at all, Your Grace? You have gone to extraordinary lengths. A fabricated debt, a forced proposal, a public plea before the king himself, to secure a wife you do not intend to touch. The debt was not fabricated by me." He crossed to a heavy oak chest near the window and withdrew from it a leather journal, worn soft with age and handling, its cover the color of dried blood. He held it out to her, and when she did not immediately take it, he set it gently in her lap instead. "It was fabricated by someone else, 11 years ago, to destroy both our families at once. I have spent 5 years proving it. I married you, Lady Evelyn, because you are the last person alive who might know why." Evelyn opened the journal with trembling hands. Inside, in a hand she did not recognize, were letters, ledger entries, sworn testimonies, decades of paper evidence, meticulously gathered, all pointing toward a single, impossible conclusion. "My father never borrowed anything from your family," she said slowly, reading, understanding beginning to dawn in cold, creeping waves. "There was no loan. The signature on Mr. Whitfield's document was forged, skillfully, but forged. I had it examined by 3 separate men of the law, none of whom knew the other had been consulted. All 3 reached the same conclusion." The Duke's jaw tightened. "Someone murdered both our fathers, Lady Evelyn. Your father did not die of a sudden illness at his writing desk, and my own father's death, 4 years before yours, was not the hunting accident the coroner recorded." The journal nearly slipped from her hands. "Murdered. Someone stole an inheritance meant to pass through both our families, spent 20 years manufacturing a debt and a feud to cover the theft, and very nearly succeeded in seeing you hanged for treason to finish what they began." He met her eyes, and there, finally, she saw the thing his composure had been built to hide. Not coldness, but grief, old and carefully buried. "Our fathers were friends, Evelyn, the closest of friends, once. I found letters between them, going back 30 years. I do not yet know who did this to us, or why, but I intend to find out, and I believe, I hope, that you may hold the final piece of the answer without knowing it." Evelyn sat very still, the journal open in her lap, the candlelight throwing long shadows across pages that had rewritten the entire architecture of her grief in a single evening. Outside the window, London slept, indifferent to the quiet collapse and rebuilding of one woman's entire understanding of her own life. "Why did you not simply tell me this before the wedding?" she asked at last. "Before the scaffold, before any of it." "Because I did not know, until I stood in that square and watched them raise the rope, how much I could not bear to lose you before I had the chance to make it right." His voice was barely more than a whisper. "I am sorry, Lady Evelyn, for all of it. I only knew one way to keep you alive long enough to tell you the truth. You might have told me sooner, in your drawing room, when first you summoned me. I did not yet trust you." He said it plainly, without apology, and she found she respected the honesty of it more than any excuse he might have offered. I did not know if you were part of it, whether your father had told you something, whether you had been raised to believe some version of events that would put you at odds with me before I had gathered proof enough to persuade you otherwise. I have spent 5 years learning to trust no one connected to this matter. It has cost me a great deal, Evelyn. I did not realize until I watched them lead you to the scaffold quite how much more it might yet cost. She looked down at the journal again, and then back at him, this stranger who was now, by every law of the land, her husband. I do not know that I trust you either, Alexander, she said quietly, using his given name for the first time. But I find that I believe you, which is not the same thing, but it is, perhaps, a beginning. He inclined his head, something that was almost a smile touching the corner of his mouth for the first time since she had known him. A beginning, he agreed. I will take it. Chapter 4. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm Evelyn could not have anticipated. She had expected, in the darkest hours of her captivity, a marriage of cold obligation and colder silence. Instead, she found herself an unwilling partner in an investigation that consumed the Duke's every waking hour, and, gradually, hers as well. His name, she learned properly now, was Alexander Voss, Duke of Ravenshire, though he rarely used the given name, and seemed almost surprised the first time she used it herself, over breakfast, asking him a question about a ledger entry from 12 years past. He answered her without hesitation, as though the question of her intelligence had never once been in doubt, and something in Evelyn loosened slightly at that. The quiet, unshowy respect of a man who did not need to be asked twice to take her seriously. Society, of course, did not extend her the same courtesy. Within a fortnight of the wedding, Evelyn was obliged to attend her first formal event as Duchess of Ravenshire, a musical evening hosted by Lady Farrington, and she felt the weight of every eye in the room settle upon her the moment she entered on Alexander's arm. She heard the whispers, not quite low enough to escape her. The Ashford girl, married under the king's own decree. One wonders what she did to earn such an unusual mercy, and felt her spine stiffen with the old, familiar instinct to disappear rather than be seen. Alexander's hand found the small of her back, steady and warm through the silk of her gown. You need not smile for them, he murmured, bending close, as though sharing some private pleasantry. You need only remain standing. You have managed considerably harder things than a room full of gossips in recent weeks. Is that meant to comfort me, Your Grace? It is meant to remind you that you have already survived a scaffold. I imagine Lady Farrington's drawing room presents somewhat lesser peril. It was, absurdly, exactly the right thing to say. Evelyn found herself suppressing a genuine laugh for the first time in months, and when she glanced up at him, she caught him watching her with an expression she did not yet have a name for, something warmer than the careful composure he wore for the rest of the room, offered, it seemed, for her alone. They did not dance that evening, for propriety's sake, given the newness and strangeness of the match, but Alexander remained at her side throughout, correcting no one's whispered assumptions aloud, but making it plain, through the simple constancy of his presence, that he would not be moved from her. It was, Evelyn thought later, its own kind of protection, not the loud, performative gallantry of a man defending his wife's honor before a crowd, but the quiet, steady refusal to leave her to face judgment alone. They worked most evenings in his study, the journal and its accompanying documents spread across the great oak desk between them. Evelyn learned that her father, Lord Ashford, and the elder Duke of Ravenshire had indeed been close friends in their youth, business partners in a shipping venture that had made both families a considerable fortune. She learned, too, that a third man had been part of that partnership, a Mr. Josiah Grantham, an ambitious solicitor who had managed the venture's finances and who had, according to the letters Alexander had gathered, grown resentful of profits he felt he had earned but never fully received. Grantham, Evelyn said one evening, turning the name over. I know that name. He handled some small matters for my father. Years ago, I remember him coming to Ashford Hall when I was a girl. He gave me barley sugar and asked me foolish questions about my dolls. Alexander went very still. What sort of foolish questions? I do not recall precisely. I was 7, perhaps 8. She frowned, trying to summon the memory more clearly. He asked where my father kept his private correspondence. I thought it an odd thing for a grown man to ask a child, and I told him I did not know, which was true. My father kept a locked box in the library. I only learned of it because I once saw him open it, and he made me swear never to mention it to anyone. Do you know what became of that box? I have not thought of it in years. It may still be at Ashford Hall, if no one has thought to search for it. The estate has not yet been fully catalogued for seizure. Mr. Whitfield delayed the process at your request, I believe. Something kindled in Alexander's dark eyes, the first true excitement she had seen in him since their wedding night. Then we must go to Ashford Hall. They did not leave immediately. There were arrangements to be made, and Evelyn found herself, in the days before their departure, drawn increasingly into the quiet orbit of her husband's daily life, in ways that had nothing to do with murder or forged debts at all. She discovered he rose early to ride, before the household woke, and one gray morning, unable to sleep, she dressed and joined him in the stables, startling the grooms nearly as much as she startled Alexander himself. "I did not take you for an early riser," he said, watching her mount with the easy competence of a woman who had ridden since childhood. "I did not take you for a man who smiles at his horse and scowls at his breakfast table," she returned, and had the satisfaction of watching him laugh, a real laugh, low and startled out of him, the first she had heard from him at all. They rode out across the frost-silvered park in near silence after that, and Evelyn found she did not mind the quiet. There was something in his company, she was beginning to understand, that did not require constant conversation to feel like companionship. He rode beside her rather than ahead, matched his pace to hers without being asked, and once, when her mare shied at a fallen branch, reached out instinctively to steady her before she had even registered the danger herself. "You need not fear for me," she told him, once her heart had settled. "I have been riding since I was 5 years old." "I am aware." His hand lingered a moment longer than strictly necessary on the reins beside hers before he withdrew it. "It appears to be an instinct I cannot easily unlearn, where you are concerned." She said nothing to that, though she thought about it, for the remainder of the ride, and for some while after. Chapter 5. They traveled north to Ashford Hall within the week, and Evelyn found herself, for the first time since her father's death, glad to see the crooked apple tree and the stone bridge over the stream, though the sight of them also brought a grief so sharp it stole her breath entirely. Alexander walked beside her through the gardens without speaking, matching his stride to hers, and when she stopped at the bridge and pressed a hand to her mouth to hold back tears, he did not offer empty comfort or false cheer. He simply stood beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, and let her grieve in silence until she was ready to walk on. It was, she thought, the kindest thing anyone had done for her in months. "My father used to fish from this very spot," she said at last, when she trusted her voice again. "He was terrible at it. He never once caught anything worth the naming, and yet he came every Sunday afternoon for as long as I can remember, rain or shine. I think he liked the quiet of it more than the fishing itself." "My father kept bees," Alexander offered, and there was something almost shy in the admission, as though he did not often speak of such things. "Terribly, if I am honest. He was stung more often than any man I have ever known, and never once complained of it. He said a man who could not tolerate a little pain had no business keeping anything worth loving." Evelyn glanced at him, surprised by the small, unguarded warmth of the memory. "You rarely speak of him." "I have spent 5 years speaking of little else, in truth, though never aloud. Every document in that journal is, in some sense, a conversation I have been having with him since his death, trying to understand what happened to him, what I might have done differently had I known sooner." He looked out over the water, his profile carved sharp against the pale afternoon light. "I did not expect to find someone I could speak of him with so easily. I find I am grateful for it." They stood together at the bridge a while longer, saying nothing further, and Evelyn understood, with a quiet unfolding certainty, that whatever this marriage had begun as, it was becoming something else entirely, something she had not asked for, and yet found herself, cautiously, unwilling to refuse. The locked box was exactly where she remembered it, hidden beneath a false panel in the library floor that her father had shown her only once, in a moment of uncharacteristic sentiment she had not understood until now. Inside were more letters, correspondence between her father and the elder Duke, warm and full of old friendship, entirely at odds with the cold business arrangement the forged debt had implied. And beneath the letters, wrapped in oilcloth, a set of shipping ledgers bearing Josiah Grantham's own hand, documenting years of quietly skimmed profits that no one had ever thought to question. "This is it," Alexander breathed, spreading the ledgers across the library table with hands that were not entirely steady. "This is the proof. Grantham embezzled from the partnership for years. When your father and my father began to suspect it, look here, this letter, dated only months before my father's death. Grantham must have realized he would be discovered. So he killed them both," Evelyn said quietly, "and fabricated a debt between our families to explain away the money he had already stolen, and to ensure neither family ever had reason to compare notes and uncover the truth. And when I began investigating 5 years ago, he must have realized I was close to the answer. The forged debt against your father. The timing, Evelyn. It was activated the moment my inquiries grew too close for his comfort. He needed a reason to seize Ashford Hall and search it before I did. He needed you removed from the estate entirely." Alexander looked up at her, and for the first time since she had known him, she saw real fear in his face. Not for himself, she realized, but for her. "He very nearly succeeded in having you executed to keep this box from ever being found." Evelyn sat down slowly in her father's old chair, the weight of 5 months of grief and confusion and fear finally arranging itself into a shape she could understand. "Where is Josiah Grantham now?" "That," Alexander said grimly, "is precisely what we must discover, before he learns that we have found this." Chapter 6. They did not have to search long. Josiah Grantham, it emerged from careful inquiries made through Alexander's solicitor, had spent the past decade quietly building a fortune of his own under a series of business interests that traced back, through several careful layers of obscurity, to the very shipping profits he had stolen. He had a townhouse in London, a seat on 2 charitable boards, and a reputation, among those who did not look too closely, as a generous and respectable man of business. Evelyn found she could summon no image of the barley sugar solicitor from her childhood in this description, and yet the ledgers did not lie. The danger of what they were undertaking made itself known sooner than either of them anticipated. A week after their return to London, a fire broke out in Alexander's study in the small hours of the night, contained quickly by an alert footman, but not before several shelves of correspondence had been reduced to ash, and not before Alexander discovered, upon examining the ruined window latch the following morning, that the lock had been forced from the outside. "Someone knows we have the ledgers," he said grimly, standing amid the scorched wreckage of his own study, Evelyn beside him, with a shawl drawn tight around her shoulders, against both the morning chill and a fear she did not wish to name aloud. This was not an accident. Someone attempted to destroy the evidence, and when they found the study locked, they resorted to fire rather than risk being seen searching it directly. Grantham, or someone acting on his behalf. He has had 20 years to cultivate friends willing to do his uglier work for him. Alexander's jaw was tight with a fury Evelyn had not yet seen from him, controlled but unmistakable. "I should have moved the original documents sooner. This is my failure, not yours." "It is not a failure to have trusted the security of your own home, Alexander." She laid a hand on his arm and felt him go still beneath her touch, the same stillness she had noticed at the bridge, as though her nearness required some careful effort of composure from him. "We have the ledgers still. The most damning of them were with us in the carriage on our return, were they not? You would not entrust them to a locked drawer alone." "No." Something in his expression eased, marginally. "No, they are safe. I confess I had not expected you to remember such a detail. I have learned, this past year, to remember every detail that might determine whether I live or die. It is not a skill I acquired willingly, but I find it has its uses now." They moved the surviving evidence that same day to a bank vault under seal, accompanied by 2 of the king's own investigators, whom Alexander had quietly retained weeks before, men accustomed to discretion in matters touching the nobility. But the fire had made plain what both of them had perhaps understood only abstractly until then, that Grantham, cornered, would not simply surrender to the slow unfolding of justice. He would fight to bury the truth by any means the truth's discovery required. It was in the anxious days that followed, waiting for some further move from an enemy they could not yet see clearly, that Evelyn found herself relying on Alexander's steadiness in a manner that surprised her with its ease. He took to sitting with her in the evenings even when there was no ledger to examine, no letter to decode, simply because, he admitted once, with the particular awkwardness of a man unused to admitting such things, he did not like the thought of her sitting alone with her fear, while his own occupied him elsewhere in the house. "You need not trouble yourself on my account," she told him one such evening, though without much conviction, curled into the window seat of the small parlor, with a book she had not managed to read a single page of. "I am aware that I need not." He settled into the chair across from her, an untouched letter of his own, forgotten on the table beside him. "I find I wish to regardless. I did not anticipate that outcome when I proposed this marriage, Evelyn, and yet here we are." "Here we are," she agreed softly, and found, watching the firelight move across his face, that she was no longer entirely certain she minded it. Chapter 7. "We cannot simply accuse him," Alexander said, pacing the length of his study one evening a fortnight later, once the immediate danger of discovery had settled into a wary, watchful calm. "Grantham has spent 20 years covering his tracks with extraordinary care. He has friends in the council, Lord Pelham in particular, sits on 2 of the same charitable boards, and has defended Grantham's character publicly on more than one occasion. If we move against him without irrefutable proof, freely given, he will simply destroy what evidence remains and turn the accusation back upon us as slander from a bitter, disgraced family, seeking to blacken an honest man's name." "Then we require a confession," Evelyn said, from the window seat where she sat with a shawl drawn around her shoulders against the autumn chill. Alexander stopped pacing. "A confession is not easily obtained from a man clever enough to have committed 2 murders and evaded suspicion for 2 decades. "No," she agreed, "but I imagine it might be obtained from a man who believes the one witness who could expose him is finally within his reach, and foolish enough, in her grief, not to understand the danger of what she carries." She watched understanding dawn across his face, followed swiftly by something like horror. "Absolutely not. You have not yet heard my proposal. I do not need to hear it to know that it involves placing yourself in danger, and I will not permit it." The word permit struck something sharp in her, old anger from a lifetime of men making decisions about her fate without her consent, and she rose from the window seat with more heat than she intended. "You will not permit it? Your Grace, I have been sold, threatened with execution, and married against my will in the space of a single fortnight, all in service of decisions made by men who believed themselves to be protecting me. I am done being protected in ways that require no participation from myself." Alexander's expression shifted, not into anger, as she half expected, but into something quieter, almost chastened. "You are right. I apologize." He sat down slowly across from her, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost its commanding edge entirely. "I am not accustomed to caring what happens to another person so much that it frightens me to lose control of the outcome. Forgive me if that fear made me speak to you as though your choices were mine to make." The admission, quiet and unguarded, undid something in Evelyn that 5 months of grief and fear had not managed to touch. She looked at him, really looked, past the Duke's title and the cold reputation and the terrible circumstances that had bound them together, and saw, for the first time, simply a man, tired, frightened for her, trying, in his own imperfect way, to do right by a wrong he had not caused, but had inherited all the same. "I know how to play the frightened widow's daughter, still grieving, still ignorant of the truth," she said gently. "I have had a great deal of practice at being underestimated, Alexander. Let me use it for once, to our advantage. If anything should happen to you, then it will happen because I chose to risk it, freely, with my eyes open, and not because some man decided the risk on my behalf without so much as consulting me. She reached across the space between them and took his hand, the first time she had done so of her own will rather than out of necessity. You said yourself, on our wedding night, that you did not yet trust me, and I told you I believed you regardless. I am asking you now to trust me in turn. Let me help end this, Alexander. I have earned that much. He was silent for a long moment, his thumb moving slowly, absently, across her knuckles, as though he had not entirely noticed he was doing it. You have earned considerably more than that, he said finally, low. Very well, but you will not go alone. I will be near enough to reach you within a heartbeat, and if I judge for even a moment that you are in true danger, I will not wait for your permission to intervene. That, Evelyn said, allowing herself the smallest smile, seems a fair enough compromise, Your Grace. The plan, when it finally took shape, was simple in its architecture and terrifying in its execution. Evelyn would call upon Mr. Grantham under the pretense of settling a small matter regarding her father's old estate papers, a natural enough errand for a young duchess newly returned to society, and, in the course of polite conversation, would allow him to believe she had discovered the hidden box in the library floor and did not yet understand its significance. Alexander, along with two of the king's own investigators, would wait nearby, close enough to intervene the moment Grantham's composure cracked. Evelyn dressed with particular care on the appointed morning, not the fine silks of a duchess, but the simpler, slightly out-of-fashion gown she might have worn as Lady Ashford of the disgraced family, a small, deliberate cruelty designed to put Grantham at ease, to remind him of the frightened, biddable girl he believed he had once known. Before she left the carriage, Alexander caught her hand once more. Evelyn, his dark eyes searched hers, unguarded in a way she had rarely seen. Whatever happens in that room, know that I am proud of you. Whatever comes of today, that will not change. She held on to the words as though they were armor, and perhaps, in their own way, they were. Grantham received her in his drawing room with every appearance of warmth, the same easy charm she vaguely recalled from childhood, though she now saw the calculation beneath it, the quick assessing glance he gave her, before settling into his chair. Lady Evelyn, forgive me, Your Grace. I must accustom myself to the new title. How extraordinary, all that has befallen you these past months. I confess I have thought of your father often. We were close, once, in business matters. Were you? Evelyn allowed her voice to waver, just slightly, the tremor of a young woman still unsteady with grief. I have found so little of his correspondence since his death, Mr. Grantham. It is strange. I recall him keeping a private box of papers in the library, when I was a girl. I have been searching Ashford Hall these past weeks, in the hope of finding some final word from him, some explanation, perhaps, of the debt that undid us all. Something flickered behind Grantham's eyes, swift, controlled, but not swift enough. A private box, you say? I found it only yesterday, hidden beneath the library floor, of all things. I have not yet had the courage to open it fully. She let her hands twist together in her lap, the perfect picture of a grieving, ignorant girl. I thought perhaps you might help me understand what I found within it, Mr. Grantham. Some of the ledgers are quite beyond my comprehension. Shipping accounts, I believe, from many years ago. The silence that followed stretched a fraction too long. When Grantham spoke again, his voice had lost its warmth entirely, gone flat and careful in a way that confirmed, more surely than any document could, everything the ledgers had suggested. You would be wise, Lady Evelyn, to burn whatever you found without reading it. Some truths are better left buried with the men who died holding them. Died, Evelyn repeated softly. You said died, Mr. Grantham, not passed or were taken by illness. You said died, as though you know precisely how my father met his end. The color drained from Grantham's face. I misspoke. I do not think you did. Evelyn kept her voice steady now, the grieving girl falling away like a discarded costume. I think you have spent 20 years waiting for someone to ask you the right question, Mr. Grantham, and I think some part of you is almost relieved that I finally have. Grantham rose so abruptly his chair scraped hard against the floor. You understand nothing of what you are accusing me of. I understand that you embezzled from a shipping partnership that made you wealthy beyond your station, that my father and the elder Duke of Ravenshire began to suspect it, and that both men died within 4 years of each other, under circumstances that were never properly investigated. I understand that you fabricated a debt against my family to ensure Ashford Hall would be seized and searched before I ever found what my father left behind. And I understand, Evelyn said, rising to her feet as the drawing-room door opened behind her, that you very nearly had me executed to keep all of it buried. Alexander stepped through the doorway, flanked by the king's investigators, his dark eyes fixed on Grantham with a coldness Evelyn had not seen since their very first meeting. "It is over, Grantham," he said quietly. "I have spent 5 years proving what you did to my father. I will not need 5 more to prove what you did to hers." Grantham's gaze darted toward the window, some final desperate calculation of escape crossing his face. But the investigators had already moved to block the exit, and whatever fight had sustained him through 20 years of careful deception seemed, in that moment, to simply drain out of him all at once. For a long moment he said nothing at all. Then, with the particular exhaustion of a man who has carried a secret so long it has become heavier than the truth ever could have been, he sank back into his chair and began, in a low and broken voice, to confess. Chapter 8. He spoke for the better part of an hour, and Evelyn listened to every word with a strange, hollow calm, as though the story he told belonged to some other family entirely, and not the quiet, ordinary life she had once known. He had managed the shipping ventures accounts for nearly a decade before either partner grew suspicious, he said, and had told himself, at first, that the small sums he diverted were no more than a fair fee for his labor, unacknowledged by 2 men too wealthy to notice or care. But the sums had grown, as such things do, and so had his fear of discovery, until the fear itself had curdled into something far uglier. "Your father found the discrepancy," Grantham said, not looking at either of them now, his eyes fixed instead on some middle distance neither Evelyn nor Alexander could see. "Lord Ashford. But he was always the more careful of the two, God rest him. He wrote to the Duke's father, suggesting they engage an independent accountant to review the venture's books together. I intercepted the letter before it could be answered. I told myself, at the time, that I only meant to delay the reckoning until I could find some way to repay what I had taken. I did not intend at first for anyone to die." "And yet they did," Alexander said, his voice carefully level, though Evelyn could feel the tension radiating from him like heat from a struck flint. "Your father grew impatient, waiting for a reply. He came to see me directly, unannounced, and accused me outright, there in my own study. I had not planned it. I want that understood, whatever good it does me now. I struck him, in the panic of the moment, harder than I intended, and when he fell, he did not rise again." Grantham's voice had dropped to something barely audible. "I arranged the hunting accident to explain it. It was not difficult. No one thought to question a duke's death upon his own land." Evelyn's stomach turned, but she did not look away. "And my father?" Lord Ashford grew suspicious in turn, some years later, when he began quietly reviewing the old venture's papers himself, perhaps searching for some explanation of his old friend's death that had never sat right with him. "I could not risk a second unexplained death, so soon after the Duke's own son began his own inquiries." Grantham's hands, Evelyn noticed, had begun to shake. "I administered something in his evening wine, foxglove, in a careful dose. The physician saw exactly what I intended him to see. A man's heart, weakened by grief and age, simply giving out at his desk. It was cleaner than the accident had been. I had learned by then to be more careful." "And the debt," Alexander said, when Evelyn found she could not immediately speak again. "The forged loan. I had always intended it as insurance, should either family ever grow too close to the truth. I forged the loan documents years before I ever used them, timed to appear precisely 11 years past, when the venture's true accounts would have shown the beginnings of my theft, had anyone thought to compare the dates. When you began your inquiries, Your Grace, and I knew of them, make no mistake, I have had eyes upon you for longer than you likely suspect. I judged it safer to activate the debt at once, to ensure Ashford Hall was searched and cleared by the Crown's own officers, before you or the girl ever thought to search it yourselves." He looked up at last, something almost like relief in his ravaged face. "I did not truly wish her dead. I want that believed. Whatever else is not. I only wished the matter buried. Her flight, her capture, that was never part of my design. I confess I did not know, until the very morning of the execution, whether I hoped she would hang, or hoped some mercy would spare her. I am not certain, even now, which answer shames me more." The confession, once complete, was swiftly formalized before witnesses and sealed for presentation to the royal council. Evelyn walked out of Grantham's drawing room on legs that did not entirely feel her own, and it was only once they were safely inside the carriage, the door shut against the world, that she allowed herself to shake. Alexander did not speak. He simply drew her against him, his arms coming around her with a certainty that asked nothing and demanded nothing, and Evelyn let herself be held for the first time since she had stood upon that scaffold and felt the whole of her life narrow down to a single terrible moment. She wept, finally, for her father, for the truth she had needed so desperately and now could hardly bear to hold, and Alexander held her through all of it, murmuring nothing but her name, low and steady, like an anchor thrown to a woman finally allowed to stop swimming. "It is over," he said at last, when her tears had quieted. "Whatever comes next, Evelyn, the truth is known. No one can take that from either of us now." Chapter 9. Justice, once set into motion, moved with a swiftness that felt almost strange after months of grief drawn thin across every ordinary day. Grantham's confession, corroborated by the ledgers and letters Evelyn and Alexander had gathered, was enough to see him arrested within the week and stripped of every fortune he had built upon two men's murders. He was tried before the royal council itself, a proceeding Evelyn chose to attend despite Alexander's gentle suggestion that she need not subject herself to it, and she found, sitting in the gallery beside her husband as the verdict was read, that she felt not triumph so much as a great and quiet stillness, as though some heavy stone she had carried without knowing its full weight had finally been set down. The forged debt against the Ashford estate was formally voided by royal decree, the record corrected before the entire council to reflect what had truly occurred. Ashford Hall, its lands and title restored in full, passed back into Evelyn's keeping, though she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she no longer wished to return there alone. Her mother, informed at last of the truth behind her husband's death, wept for 3 days, and then, unexpectedly, began to heal in a way 5 months of unexplained grief had never allowed her to do. Evelyn visited her weekly through that winter, and watched, with a gratitude too large for words, as some of the old warmth and wit crept slowly back into Lady Ashford's face, as though grief, once given its true shape, could finally be set down, rather than carried forever, as a shapeless, gnawing weight. "You have your father's stubbornness," her mother told her one afternoon, over tea in the small sitting room at Ashford Hall, studying Evelyn with an expression that held both pride and a lingering, careful sorrow. "He would have been glad to see it serve you so well in the end. I only wish he had lived to see what you have made of this terrible year." "I think he would have liked Alexander," Evelyn said, and found, saying it, that she believed it entirely. There is a particular mercy, Evelyn came to understand, in grieving a truth rather than a mystery. She and Alexander did not speak of what would come next for many weeks, both of them perhaps, afraid to disturb the fragile new thing that had grown quietly between them across long evenings of shared work and shared danger. But one evening in early December, with snow beginning to fall soft and silent outside the windows of Ravenshire House, Evelyn found him in his study, not working, for once, but simply standing at the window, watching the snow gather on the bare branches of the garden below. "You are thinking of your father," she said, coming to stand beside him. "I am thinking that he would have liked you very much," Alexander said quietly. "He always said the measure of a person was not how they behaved when the world watched, but how they behaved when it did not. I think he would have been glad to see me marry someone who proved that true." Evelyn considered him for a long moment, this careful, complicated man who had come to her scaffold on foot, who had knelt in the dirt before his king, who had placed the truth in her hands on their wedding night, instead of claiming what the law would have freely given him. She thought of the marriage that had begun as an act of desperate survival, and the strange, slow thing it had become instead. "I do not think," she said slowly, "that I regret marrying you, Alexander. Not any longer. I did once, bitterly, in the beginning. But I find I cannot summon that bitterness now, however hard I search for it." He turned to face her fully, something cautious and hopeful moving behind his dark eyes. "And what do you feel instead, Evelyn?" She did not answer with words at first. She reached up, slowly, and laid her palm against his jaw, the first time she had ever touched him without the shadow of obligation or fear standing between them, and felt him go very still beneath her hand, as though he could not quite believe she meant it. "Gratitude," she said softly, "and respect. And something else besides, which I have been too frightened to name, though I think you have felt it too." "I have felt very little else, if I am honest," Alexander admitted, his voice rough. "Since the moment you refused to sit down in my drawing room and told me you would rather face the truth on your feet. I do not think I have thought of much besides you since. Not even Grantham? Not even the investigation that consumed 5 years of your life before I ever entered it? Especially not Grantham," he said, and there was something almost rueful in it, a small, unguarded laugh. "I have caught myself, more than once these past weeks, forgetting entirely why I first sought you out, and remembering only that I did not wish the evening to end without seeing you across the dinner table first." When he kissed her, finally, it was nothing like the wedding night she had once braced herself against in fear. It was slow and careful, and asked a question rather than claimed an answer, and Evelyn found herself answering it freely, without hesitation, for the first time in a year, defined almost entirely by choices that had never truly been her own. Epilogue. They were married again the following spring, in a small ceremony at Ashford Hall's own chapel, with her mother in attendance and no royal decree standing over either of their heads. It was not strictly speaking necessary. They were already husband and wife under the law. But Evelyn had asked for it all the same, wanting one wedding day that belonged entirely to her, chosen freely, without the shadow of debt or death or duty standing behind the altar. Alexander wore, she noted with some amusement, considerably less composure than he had at their first wedding, his hands unsteady as he slid the ring onto her finger, though this time she understood the tremor for what it was, not fear, but joy, plain and unguarded, in a man who had spent 5 long years learning to bury both. The chapel had been decorated simply, with branches of early apple blossom cut from the very tree Evelyn had climbed as a girl. And as she walked toward the altar on no one's arm but her own, another small freedom she had insisted upon, she caught sight of Mrs. Pemberton weeping openly in the second pew, and of her mother, radiant in a way Evelyn had feared she might never see again, and of Alexander himself watching her approach with an expression so unguarded, so entirely without the careful composure he had once worn like armor, that Evelyn felt her own eyes fill before she had even reached him. "You are not meant to weep at your own wedding, Your Grace," he murmured, when she stood before him at last. "I believe I am entitled to weep at whichever of my weddings I choose," she returned, and he laughed. That same low, startled laugh she had first coaxed from him on horseback nearly a year before, and which she had come, since, to treasure above almost every other sound in the world. Standing in the garden afterward, beneath the crooked apple tree she had once thought she would never see again, Evelyn looked out at the assembled guests, her mother, finally smiling, Alexander's household staff, who had come to regard her with genuine warmth over the winter months, Mrs. Pemberton, already deep in conversation with Alexander's own housekeeper, as though the two women had been friends for years, the quiet, steady presence of the man beside her, who had once been a stranger delivering the worst news of her life, and had become, against every reasonable expectation, the truest partner she had ever known. "What are you thinking?" Alexander asked, his hand finding hers among the folds of her gown. "That I walked toward this marriage the first time, believing I was walking toward my own destruction," she said, "and that I could not have been more wrong, though it took nearly losing everything to learn it." "We very nearly did lose everything," he said quietly. "Yes." She turned to face him fully, the autumn of grief and danger falling away behind her like a season finally ended. "But we did not. And I find, Alexander, that I would walk the entire path again, every terrible hour of it, if it led me here regardless. I would spare you every hour of it if I could, he said, and give you only this. Perhaps? She smiled, something soft and certain settling behind her eyes. But I do not think I would be the woman standing before you now, had I been spared it. I think I needed to learn, first, exactly how much I was capable of surviving, before I could allow myself to simply be happy. He kissed her then, in the garden where she had grieved him once as a stranger, and now loved him as her husband, and somewhere beyond the orchard wall, the bells of the village church rang out across the quiet Regency countryside, carrying the news of a wedding that had, at last, become entirely what it should always have been, not a debt repaid, nor a duty discharged, but a promise, freely given, between two people who had found, in the wreckage of two ruined families, something neither of them had ever expected to find at all.